Welcome to Global Voices, the critical knowledge podcast, loud and clear from the world to you.
With Global Voices, we aim to bring together experts, activists, and students for forward-thinking and cross-boundary discussions about topics of global relevance. I'm Sascha Husenbeeth, and I study social psychology and international studies at Roskilde University in Denmark. And I'm happy to introduce you to our podcast.
The environmental changes wrought by the coronavirus are hard to miss. Global carbon emissions have fallen substantially, giving us an insight into what the world could look like without fossil fuels. The unprecedented restrictions on travel, work, and industry due to the coronavirus has ensured several days with good quality air in our otherwise choked cities. Pollution is also considerably down across the continents. Wildlife has returned to places. Is this just a fleeting event or could it lead to longer lasting changes? We discuss this today with our two special guests. The first is Professor T.Jayaraman, who is a senior fellow of climate change at the M.S. Swaminathan Research Foundation in Chennai, in India. He was a professor at the School of Habitat Studies at Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. He's a theoretical physicist, and his interests include climate change and policy, economics of climate change, and agriculture. Our second guest is Dr. Tamara Steger, a professor of environmental justice and politics at the Central European University, now in Austria. She looks at social justice movements and politics and the environment. We welcome both of you to the show. I would start with TJ. Uh, Given the theme of our episode today, could you tell a little more about the ecological impact that is going to take place because of the lockdown?
Good evening or good morning, depending on where you are. And let me first thank you for having me on your podcast. Now, I am quite firmly of the view that the environmental changes, uh, which are in any case quite moderate, quite limited, that you see around you are definitely fleeting. So it is not as if that we have not had occasions where for several days, of the order of 2 or 3 days, there has been no traffic and so on. In India, we are very familiar with political situations where there is a general strike called in the city, there is no traffic. So this kind of thing does happen. So this, of course, is extended on an unprecedented scale. We have had no public transport in my city of Chennai in India for something like more than a month now. It's about 39 or 40 days that we haven't had public transport. So there are a number of such things which make for less pollution. Uh, there are, that is only one part of it. I think, however, and there are a lot of images that you see, particularly on the net, on social media, about there's penguins walking down the middle of Cape Town, deer walking through small communities, leopards roaming on campuses in Mumbai. But I think these, some of them are actually fake. So let's be clear about that. But even where they are not, a majority of them speak to changes that are absolutely fleeting. So to think of the current pandemic as having brought about any lasting environmental change is, I think, quite substantially incorrect. It has made us think about the environment in very important ways. And I think one must not underestimate the importance of that, or one must weigh the kind of impact it has had. But has it impacted the environment? My real answer is no. So maybe since that was your question, I'll stop here and wait for my colleague to say what, express her opinion, and we could go on.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting us for this discussion. I think, I generally certainly agree with TJ about what the implications are for the long term. Will we have some sweeping changes in terms of how we operate? I'm not so sure either. There's a lot of discussion about how soon can we get back to normal and so on. And I think there's a lot of references to the economy in that, hidden in that, or very explicit in that. But something that I think that we can't really go back to thinking about things the way we used to with such a global event as this. And when it comes to the environment, I think this is an opportunity to reconsider how we've been thinking about it and defining it. That we see now how interconnected we are. And we're all facing this issue, albeit in very different ways, mind you, and especially when it comes to inequalities, which are now exacerbated under these circumstances. However, I think that the environment, it's a time for us to reconceptualize clearly and make headway on understanding that the environment is not something that is out there and that surrounds us, but rather we are enmeshed, and it's dynamic and flowing, and that it's this sort of living biopermeability that we experience. And the impacts, I think, also reveal a lot about that as well. There was just this, I just read something recently about this research at Stanford University by Marshall Burke, who found that that the lives saved from local pollution reductions and he did the study in China, of course, using the data there. So the reductions exceed COVID-19 deaths in China, and potentially the global death toll from the virus. So in other words, the impacts of our ongoing polluting activities have a far greater impact on premature death than COVID-19. At least that's the implication from his study, which I find interesting. And it's a real moment for us to pause and think about the way we're living and the impacts that have on everything. So whether or not where we go from here, this is a moment. This is a moment. This is an opportunity, as is every crisis, where we can see where we want to go from here, maybe have a moment to reflect as things have slowed down, and think about where we want to go from here. And we can already see some indication of that unfortunately, some sort of see this crisis as an opportunity to take advantage. So, for example, weaken environmental laws or standards. It reveals a lot about our governance regimes, if you will. So, will they take advantage by taking opportunities to insert harsher, further controls, or will they reveal something about their capacities to take care of the people and to address inequalities, which are further exacerbated under these circumstances? So, what do you think about? Thank you, Shreya.
Yeah, I was wondering if TJ would like to respond to what Tamara spoke right now.
I think we are sort of, both of us, I think have a lot of similar concerns because now perhaps the way I would look at it is that one of the issues that bothers me in the discourse that is built up around the pandemic is the use of the word we. So there was this wit on Facebook who wrote saying that, when what happens to the poor happens also to the rich, then they start talking about how we have a problem. So I think that kind of expresses some of the concerns, is quite wittily, some of the concerns we have. So the first point to note about our reaction to the pandemic in all areas of activity or social or public life, and that will apply to the way we deal with the environment, is that it is not a moment where inequalities have been submerged in the need to be together. So in fact, inequalities have been exacerbated. Inequalities condition the response to the pandemic crisis in all societies. Uh, uh, the uber rich, if you will, have retreated into a sort of silence peppered by, I have nothing against it, noble acts of charity and so on. But the fundamental reasons why we live in an unequal world, and a grossly unequal world at that, have not changed a bit. Is something in this kind of overflowing of the togetherness that is hyped up so much. I think we should really cast, if I may say so, a baleful eye on that kind of smoothing over inequalities. Unfortunately, even where the message is one genuinely of togetherness, and I am very struck by, say, the example of New Zealand, like the New Zealand Prime Minister. And she has done, by all accounts, a marvelous job of leadership, etc. But you see, in the whole discourse that comes around it, even though she herself talks of we, a 5 million team, etc., referring to the population of New Zealand, nevertheless, all the focus is on her. So across the world, it is the quality of the individual leadership. And there are exceptions. I think in Kerala, in India, there's a lot of writing publicly about it now, even internationally. It is ruled by a left party coalition led by two of the communist parties in the country. I think what really is distinctive there is that even though the chief minister, who's the head of government in the province, is a leader in the sense that you see everywhere, but I think they have managed to create a wave of civil society involvement. Not just civil society, very often that's just a code word for NGOs. It's not just that. I mean, it really, the initiative led by popular, local, regional, self-governing government institutions. So it's not the NGOs who are doing it. It's not voluntarism, but there is a structured setup of initiatives that arise at various levels. And that, I think, is a very distinctive experience. For most of the rest of the world, it is charitable organizations, politely referred to as civil society. There are NGOs, of course. Their motivations are excellent. I mean, I have no quarrel with that. But it is still the leaders, centralized leadership, and voluntary action funded by the rich. It's not as if the poor are the ones funding the NGOs. And I think this is not a great model for the future. And so it is not very clear in terms of uh, the world that we live in, how we will organize and go about dealing with it, whether indeed an emergency of this kind, and I really refer to it in parallel with the talk of climate emergency, whether the term emergency is really something that points the way forward. So that's is sort of a reflection. I have been writing about this on social media elsewhere. So that's something that's quite a bit on my mind in this context.
Yeah, I mean, what I can discern from something that Tamara has said, but also from your point, reminds me of something that was a central quote in the introduction of the last semester project that I've been involved in last semester about the Anthropocene. And it goes like this. It says, in the Anthropocene, one needs to simultaneously recognize the integrative dimension of the problem, which is the aggregated impact of human action became a geological force, and the differentiated dimension of the real human life, which is that not all contributed equitably to its historical construction, and that not all equally experienced its consequences, not in the same shape or degree. In a sense, the new environmental reality unifies the whole of humanity, and in another, there is a visceral inequality. This is from Padua, who's a Brazilian scholar. And this seems to me to be a really central kind of sociological observation, that if we're looking at the Anthropocene as a term, it makes it seem like there's one actor, which is human beings, and in a way it kind of obscures or makes it makes necessary to emphasize very much that in fact it's not one actor, it's a whole lot of different actors that are stratified and that in a way hold each other back and oppress each other and these kinds of things. And so this is for Tamara a question. What do you think about the term Anthropocene? Do you think it's helpful, or do you think it kind of conflates or obscures human beings into an undifferentiated one actor that is not in fact one? Or do you think we should become one actor? What do you think about that?
Again, I see this as that it's really one of the debates that this issue is highlighted. It is the debate about culture and nature, and I really don't see these things as separate, but rather mutually formative, if you will. And so I do see it as an interactive dynamic. And I think thinking of it that way opens up different ways of how things evolve. I agree with TJ about this idea of we. I mean, certainly, my we is different from other people's we, if you will. And I feel very fortunate, especially when I, compare my situation to a good part of the world, and people who, not to say that I don't have my own struggles, but relatively speaking, there are tremendous struggles in and around the world that, that's a whole other we, in a way, from my we, if you think about it. However, I want to make a distinction about that yes, we don't experience this the same way, and there are multiple we's, and however, it is an interactive, intertwined, dynamic process that all of us are engaged in, not in the same way. I want to emphasize that, not in the same way, not with the same experience or impacts or benefits to all. That's for sure. I mean, even recently in the United States, they're finding that Black Americans are suffering quite a bit more than white Americans are from this this tragedy, and sadly, that's not surprising, and it has to do with a whole host of issues, you know, at which the heart of is discrimination and racism. So, so I want to make a distinction about we are interconnected, all of us, and not just human beings, but living and non-living, interconnected in this process. But yes, not the same by any stretch of the imagination. So I find the Anthropocene word to be an interesting one to think about things and you know, try to grapple with this way of understanding our world as an intertwined process that is dynamic and mutually formative. You know, with multi-species agency, I think it's a move in the right direction to have these kinds of discussions, that we cannot isolate anything from everything else. And so I think that's an important way to think about this. And yeah, and that I do feel, you know, we keep having to use the word we anyway, but it's always a good question. Who is the we? But I do think that there is I want to say something about responsibility. I'm not sure how to go forward with that, and certainly those in political positions certainly have responsibility in a way that others maybe don't have. However, I do see that there is a role for everything in this. There is a role, and so.
You bring up
good question. Thank you, Sasha. Good question.
Thank you. You bring up the term agency, and you kind of hint at the idea that agency is not simply or only a human ability, but that there might be agencies, or that there are agencies that are non-human. And this is quite a metaphysical observation, which makes me think of T.J., because my initial reaction when I saw that you are a theoretical physicist was to wonder what kinds of thoughts and what kinds of contributions we can take from this abstract physics about things themselves and how they change. This is a very vague way of putting it, but yes, just.
Actually, I didn't object at the beginning, but I have not done physics for now close on 17 or 18 years. I've not done physics, meaning I was professionally a physicist. I taught physics I did research in theoretical physics. I have a couple of PhD students who got their degrees with me, but I have not done physics for quite some time. And much of my engagement recently, especially with the environment, has been precisely in this area of culture and environment. So the way we think about the environment has some impact on the way we act on the environment. Though I would caution that, if you just leave it here, then it begs the question of where do our ideas about the environment come from? And so I think they do come from the anthropologists would say material culture. I would prefer the rather old-fashioned term practice or whatever, but we are roughly talking of the same thing. So when I think about the 2 points I want to make here in response to Tamara's observations, one is, see, on the face of it, Anthropocene, well, is one of these buzzwords you create, and there are plenty of buzzwords around. I'm not going to grudge people a new buzzword, but I think there is a very problematic point here, and that is the erasure of all that we have learned about society, sociology, economics, and all these other things about the world, social and the natural world. Somehow the argument is we are in a new age and these don't somehow count. So I've had a lot of engagement with the IPCC, and there is a real problem with the way they deal with things. So they'll talk about climate and development. Marshall Burke from Stanford is a great example. And it is as if climate and development begins with the IPCC. So the IPCC has there is in fact a 150-year literature in anthropology, for instance, which engages with the material culture and the environment. And this goes back to Louis Morgan, it influenced Marx. There's all kinds of work which has been done. But the most you'll get in the IPCC out of all of this mountain is a little molehill called behavioral economics. So this Anthropocene becomes in the climate and environmental discourse a kind of erasure of all that we have learned so far, and it's setting aside. So when we talk about the we and differentiating the we, so let's go back to old-fashioned sociology, social stratification. And in India, as Shreya would recognize immediately, stratification is caste, class, and gender. There it is, and right in front of you. So I think the problematic aspect of this totalizing term, is not a term I like very much, but it is very appropriate here. Anthropocene is used in the discourse as a totalizing term, which I find problematic. Now, is very similar, at least, when you had earlier Ulrich Beck, for instance. Ulrich Beck was at least frank about it. It was open. And he said, okay, we had earlier industrial society, and there the divisions were based on class. The risks were all to do with livelihoods, incomes, employment, physical well-being, etc. And this is behind us. So now what we have ahead of us, the second modernity, if you wish, and reflexive modernization a la Giddens. So he said we have the risk society. So the risk society is that people are differentiated not on these questions, but on the basis of risk. Now, the pandemic should put an end to that kind of simplistic feelings about the risk society when you see how risk is actually physically manifest in the way it affects the lives of people. So I have I certainly is, if I may say so, uh, this celebration of the young, the Greta Thunberg phenomenon. I think it is fine. I mean, people should, if youth take a role in it, is very important. But there is a very uncomfortable relationship between the powers that be and in the neoliberal era, if I may say so, and this celebration of youthfulness, which again I think has to do with the erasure of our historical memory, the memory of our academic life, the scholarship that the world has seen on all these questions, and they are posed here as if we are asking them for the first time. So I think one must be, this is in this sense that I'm a little wary of the discourse of the Anthropocene. As far as physics and the physical sciences are concerned, they have their place. So for instance, as I often tell my students in class, if you're walking down the road, a human being is hardly the sum total of his or her skeleton, muscle mass, and brain weight. So you are hardly simply a physical agglomeration is defining a human being. But if you are in a motor accident, that is what determines whether you live or not, your physical structure. If your physical structure is damaged beyond repair, you don't survive. So I think the physical is the skeleton of the world. And so the physical sciences inform us of the skeleton of the world. And so, like you need orthopedists for human bodies, you need physics for the world. But I think that hardly, exhausts either nature or the social. However, there is another aspect I just want to touch on here about agency. Now, I am really, I must say, a strong skeptic of the idea of multi-species agency. I think we mistake this. You can see it in a lot of pandemic writing. People write of the wily virus. This virus that is hard to defeat. So you anthropomorphize the virus. That has nothing to do with, it has no conscience, it's not a sentient being. It's just RNA. You can put it in a test tube, like the famous example students learned, like the tobacco mosaic virus. You put it in a test tube, it will sit there like a crystal, transparent, nothing will happen. You put it on a tobacco leaf, it will multiply with amazing rapidity and destroy the plant. So if you call that agency, I don't think so. There is some amount of programmed action as you go through the evolutionary chain. There is, the biologist Ernst Mayr used to call it the teleonomic capacity. It's not teleological, but teleonomic. So there is, but these are hardwired, if I may say so. Agency is the property of humanity. And therefore, what we have before us in the Anthropocene, if I may use those words, is we must realize the extent of our responsibility to nature. So we have reached a point where we transform the world around us, as in climate change. So we have to recognize who we are. We cannot relapse into theology. Oh my God, don't open the Pandora's box of viruses in these deep, dark forests where biodiversity is preserved. I mean, I think that kind of discourse is pretty useless, even though it comes from a lot of biologists. Nor can we say foolishly, Trump-like, oh, it doesn't matter. Let's get back to work, guys. You know, we're going to die. Some of us will die anyway, and it's certainly less than the people from the Spanish flu. So I don't think either extreme is correct, but we need to take charge of the fact that we need to become aware of the fact, self-reflexively, of the fact that we are now in many ways in charge of nature. And we have been for a long time, but we are so in an incredibly powerful way. And so it's a give and take process, and it is something you have to go ahead. There's no going back. And sometimes I am very concerned that the talk of multi-species agency, or stuff like, you know, actor network theory, where even the inanimate pushes back, so to speak. I'm really not a fan of those kinds of thought. I do not find them productive in a task of going forward. Let me stop here.
If I can, I would like to respond then maybe to some of these points. Yes, the Anthropocene as a buzzword. We're always coming up with new ones, and sometimes they look the same as the old things we've been doing in a way, although perhaps there is some part of that also, that where we forget where we've been, or somehow it attempts to erase where we've been. And I think that's a concern. It made me think while you were talking about Arturo Escobar's work, where he talks more about history and the biophysical, because I think history is very important. You know, it's the processes by which we come to be where we are now, and not to say that it's deterministic, but very powerful. And so that was a good point, I think, that you made about the term Anthropocene. I do want to say, though, that this idea of our skeleton, that yes, it sounds very straightforward, that if something happens to our bodies, then that's it. But something you said earlier also acknowledges spirituality. To say that we are merely physical as well as, you know, yes, seems to reduce us in a way that maybe some would agree with and maybe others wouldn't. I don't know. So I think that there's lots of different ways to think about existence. And yeah, the idea of the virus, so or multi-species agency and so on, that I think what that indicates is that, okay, yeah, on the one hand, there's an anthropomorphization of the virus and the way that it's talked about. But I think that only shows us that the virus is culturally embedded. And I'm sure that the way that it's anthropomorphized is different in different parts of the world and by different people. I was thinking when you said, so, you know, this issue, this question about agency, and following through on that, is it the property of humanity? I don't agree, and I don't think the distinction is that in every other case it's hardwired, but not in our case, as if humans were somehow special or superseded that idea. But not to say that I think that every living thing is hardwired. No, on the contrary, I think that again, I want to emphasize this interactivity and emergence through that intertwined existence. So I think that's a question, right? That so every other living thing is hardwired, but human beings as bodies are or as agency is something else. So that's a question to think about. Yeah, and yet, yeah, I appreciate that you mentioned, so there's the Pandora's box, you know, versus the Trump idea. And you said that this idea of we need to take charge and self-reflexivity. And you mentioned the idea of being in charge of nature. Now, while I can appreciate that, yes, you look around and you go, wow, we certainly have been in charge in some ways. However, again, I want to come back to this idea of enmeshment and interactivity, being intertwined and dynamic. You know, you can certainly say that, well, you know, and there's anthropomorphization of that, of those ideas as well, in terms of, like, you think of hurricanes. So are we in charge there? And how do we talk about hurricanes and their quote unquote agency? So, and who or what is in charge ultimately there? But I don't want to ignore the sort of the impacts that humans have in this interactivity. Yeah, I just wanted to re-emphasize that, and you know, how we understand the environment, certainly, or how we think about it, certainly is related to how we interact within it, and as part of it, or maybe not. Because I think thinking of it as something separate has a huge impact. Thinking of nature as something out there and something that we're in charge of, I see that as very problematic. And a hurricane need only remind us how humble we might be, or something as small as a virus, so small and yet so powerful as well. But I do want to say that too, as well, that I also feel the same way you do, that there is a responsibility here, and that that rather than thinking of, you mentioned something about, you know, you take a role in this. And I want to add to that, that we have a role. We are in a role already doing something that is either helping things move along or not, or what, but inevitably by default, we are in a role of some kind. And I hope that, that reimagining or countering the discourse, you mentioned practice or buzzwords, I'm going to use the word discourse, countering the discourse that the environment or natural resources is something separate that we're in charge of, and there's a long history of talk about domination of nature and so on. I think this is a good moment, as many have been in the past, to yet again, maybe we can, you know, rethink that idea and find, discover something more truthful about the place in all this.
I hear the...
Can I
yeah, for sure.
respond to something, some of the issues that Tamara raised? I think I still have a problem, I think, with when I said in charge, okay, that is, you are in charge proviso the laws of nature. Like, for instance, you know, you, after all, you are not in charge of you are not in charge of the law of gravity. Either you jump out of the window from the 4th floor, there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah,
but
that's gravity's agency.
No, it's just there, I think. But on the other hand, agency consists in the fact that we can build aeroplanes, and then of course the law of gravity does not stop us from flying. It seems a very trite example, but I think it goes to the heart of the problem. That's one dimension of it. But I think another dimension that connects uh, hurricanes to pandemics together, the hurricane to the virus, this enormous several hydrogen bombs worth of force and energy with this little, strip, this collection of atoms that you cannot even see, and still how
Yeah,
it.
I don't want to say anything too that I didn't mean to imply
No,
that the hurricane is the same. A
no, no.
hurricane is the same as, okay.
No,
Okay.
no. That's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
But I
Thank you.
am saying that in fact that there is a commonality here, and that is the role of contingency. So we are faced when we deal with nature. We talk about it as capricious nature, and sometimes, of course, the perfect storm. People call the pandemic the perfect storm, and in fact, that is a metaphor taken out of the hurricane context. So I think so. What we miss here is our ability to deal with contingency. So when we are faced with accident, like a very elderly Japanese colleague whom I had met in climate negotiations, I wrote to him after the last Japanese tsunami, wondering whether he was well, he was safe. He was. And he replied, speaking about the puniness of the individual in the face of the fury of nature. That was a very common metaphor. But I think that's okay. I mean, there is a place for that kind of feeling. But I think more seriously, philosophically or in the social sciences, we must recognize there a theological retreat from facing up to the problem of contingency. So contingency is a part of human life. And like I said about motor accident, let it not be a motor accident that you are camped under a tree. I suppose you should not camp under a tree, and the bow breaks. It's an old tree. It falls on your head, and notwithstanding your brilliant, insightful career ahead of you, there it is at an end. I mean, I hate to put it so brutally, but I think this speaks to the way, individuals, cultures, societies react to the problem of uncertainty. And I think we must account for the contingency of the world around us. And so you take the biologists, for instance, the environmentalists, many of them are after, oh, this is the moment we are going to have to stop every pandemic. You are never going to be able to stop every pandemic. Is that the pandemics will become rarer. The pandemics will become more infrequent. And so the fact that we have to, yes, reasonably zoonosis, take care of the animal, wildlife, human interaction, human livestock, wildlife interaction, understand it. All of that is important, but there is nevertheless going to be contingency. So I think the environmentalist idea of the undisturbed ecosystem, I think frankly is impossible to attain. And it is in this sense, I think on the one hand, we do have agency, so we are, I think, responsible for nature in a way that we did not imagine before. But nevertheless, we are responsible in a sense, partly in an anthropomorphized way, in sense, because it speaks to our own well-being. I mean, there is no well-being on Mars. And before there were the human species. I mean, there is no sense of well-being in the interaction of a lion and a deer. No? I mean, monkeys, chimpanzees don't die in hospital, surrounded by grieving relatives, their life prolonged to the extent possible by the advances of medical science, unless they are in a zoo. In the wild, there is no such thing. So we are responsible for nature. Even when I say take care of nature, I do recognize there is still a level of anthropomorphization implicit in that, but because it speaks to our well-being. But beyond that, I think there is nowhere else to go. You know, there is one planet and there is one
So can you
species.
disconnect our well-being? There's the our word with the we, but human well-being or and cultural well-being and so on. Can you separate that from?
No, I think a good
Anything
subject.
else?
No, it's good subject for investigation. I'm negative about it. Is this whole slogan of one health that you hear? You know, very popular these days. Human health, animal health, and ecosystem health. Now, what exactly is ecosystem health? The pristine, untouched ecosystem? The modified ecosystem? Which ecosystem? That's not very clear. I think it's the whole notion to me of ecosystem health is seems to be incoherent. But on the other hand, you know, maybe I'm a fuddy-duddy and the new generation will figure out how to deal with it. So,
No, I think it's more of a diversity issue, that well-being is sort of defined in place, if you will. So there's not a sort of singular idea about well-being for all is this necessarily, although we do have common experiences, but I think well-being is a placemaking activity, to be defined by many and in different places and in different ways.
Well, I can hear.
Sorry, Sasha, go ahead.
Certain kinds of things running through that in fact that seem like they are opposed, but that are actually not, in a way, which is the whole framework of what the role of the human is, and how to conceptualize that, because I do feel like we already have a framework with which to make sense of this role and the questions. It's just a framework that has been, precisely because it's so important and so subversive and so central to the question of modern emancipation, which is Marxism, has been, silenced or misrepresented or forgotten and swept under the rug. But as T.Jayaraman has mentioned, Marx has been very well aware of the dependency of capitalism on destroying nature, as well as other economists and historians. For example, Karl Polanyi, who has of course been extremely influential, or especially recently now more influential in conceptualizing the idea that that capitalism is foundationally built on the commodification of, among other things, nature. And so I feel like the question that we've kind of been hovering around is the question of capitalism, the question of how do we organize our society economically, and the question of power, because when we talk about responsibility, really we're talking as well about power to some extent. So I would like to know, I would like to ask both of you, to what extent do you think the current corona pandemic might to some extent revitalize emancipatory thought and action in the kind of Marxist framework, or in the framework of workers coming together and exercising power independently from whatever framework of power they are subjugated by. And I mean, I really don't mind who takes up the question. Maybe T.Jayaraman, because I've mentioned you, or yeah. Okay, Tamara, you can take the question.
Those are good points and good questions to think about, and yeah, coming back to the original theme of this discussion about the environmental impacts of COVID-19. Well, I think yeah, the issue of production certainly is related to pollution effects, and we can see that they coincide significantly. As you know, production is reduced, pollution is reduced, and that also certainly means you know, and has meant that people are losing jobs, especially those in precarious positions. It's a huge impact. And given the way we're talking about the environment, it's a huge impact on the environment, because these people are in and part of that. They're not separate from that. And so when we talk about impacts on the environment, we're talking about, yeah, the well-being of existence. And I'm sure T.J. will have something to say about that. But yeah, this is a question. So something that comes to my mind, Sasha, when you were talking about that and capitalism and so on, is that, you know, at what point or in what way, who is benefiting from all of this production in a maximized way, and who's losing, or to what extent are we winning and losing? That's why I brought up the Stanford University research, because it's an interesting question, isn't it? That all of this production is creating, actually reducing in some ways our, you know, or it's contributing to premature deaths. But not to acknowledge also that all of the advances in the medical field have also prolonged our lives in many ways. But are we living in a way that is conducive to our well-being? And that's a question. So it doesn't, you know, as you know, there's lots of discussion about whether that puts production into question or not. Or can we just have green production? And that's a really important discussion. But I think it's clear too, I want to come back to the other issue in the beginning of the discussion as well, that pollution definitely impacts people differently and across those traditional lines, as TJ mentioned, of race, class, and gender. That's for sure. And we see that's the case also with this virus. So yeah, so how things will evolve, I don't know, but I think seeing these things as intertwined and enmeshed creates the possibility perhaps for more well-being rather than less. And yeah, so TJ, maybe you have some.
I really, you know, I don't always use the label Marxist, because though I love the old man, and you know, I really love, you know, reading. You know, I think the ultimate intellectual experience in many ways is to be able to sit down and understand Marx, but I don't call myself a Marxist because a lot of people who call themselves Marxists have so many opinions that I completely and thoroughly disagree. So let me say on just because of the academic background to our discussion that I'm very unsympathetic to this the way people like David Harvey, John Bellamy Foster, and in the pop version, Naomi Klein, etc., have conceptualized this issue of capitalism in the environment. So I think what to me fundamentally is mistaken.
What are you, if I could ask quick, just in between there, what issues do you have with those thinkers like David
I'm
Harvey?
just coming to that.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think my problem, and it is most focused with their admiration of this book in which they are collectively all together, perhaps not Harvey so much, about this book called Big Farms, Big Flu, very popular. And I think Sasha referred to that implicitly about Marx and exploitation of nature, etc. Marx, you must remember, you must not take him literally on agriculture because, as he partly consciously realized, he lived before the industrial revolution in agriculture truly came to be. So fertilizer was just on the horizon, and the nitrogen cycle had barely been understood. Uh, the breeding and etc. Darwin had just arrived, and so all of the advances that make for modern agriculture as we know it today as a science and a technology was before it. So there is, I think, there is not sufficient recognition of this fact, I think, in this literature. So Marx spoke of a metabolic rift, but Marx, unlike many other things, he did not argue how exactly it was to be resolved. And I'm sure, part of the reason was the fact that the science of the times were certainly not up to it. Now we have a much better understanding of global geochemical cycles and what is it that are the problems and even the potential means of overcoming them are now available to us through many new technologies. So like, for instance, if you want to reduce the fertilizer intake, you could do other things. You could re-engineer the plant. For instance, genetic engineering is certainly possible. But many of these people, now, the problem is about understanding production, as Tamara quite rightly pointed out, production and who benefits from production. See, I think the classical distinction between the production of objects and their use for various purposes and these products or the process of production as generating value, wealth, and profit and accumulation thereof, I think these have to be kept relatively separate. The problem of environmental, ecological economics, if you wish, in a sense, like Herman Daly, etc., is to conflate the two completely. The two are related, like we find out now in the coronavirus crisis. You can have all the money you want in the world, but if you can't make masks, you are done for. So you have the Americans rushing off the whoever it is and trying to pirate masks out of China. So you do need goods, that they are the physical foundation of living. But I think what has happened in this strain of Marxist debate is that you separate production and why production is necessary, and with that science and technology, you completely conflate it, to use Marxist language, with the relations of production. So I think On the one hand, I think production will not cease. I'm not a fan of degrowth. In India, if you just step out of the door, I think degrowth makes no sense. The fact that the material needs of well-being are not met for vast sections of people across the world is a reality, and one has to deal with it. But on what
But
terms?
maybe degrowth doesn't mean that. Maybe degrowth for some doesn't mean that you're deprived.
We'd have to have a whole new discussion on that. And okay,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
want so I think to separate the two, if you are looking at it from a Marxist viewpoint, is, I think, important. A relative separation is not an absolute separation, and therefore I think that is what is at issue. Unfortunately, do we live are we in a transformatory moment where capitalism will be called into question, as many people, I think Sasha has this hope. I would hope too, but regrettably, I don't think so. Take
Yeah.
Mr. Boris Johnson. He is responsible for, if you ask me, for so many people dying. And they could have done much better, but his approval rating is 60%. Mr. Trump, I keep my fingers crossed. I hope against hope Mr. Trump is going to win. Mr. Modi in India is certainly extremely popular with the measures he is taking, though in the intellectual policy, even economists, bankers, everybody, they are massively critical of the way the government of India is handling, particularly the economic fallout of the COVID-19 and the response measures. But he's going to win. So much as I would have it, as I would like to agree with Sasha, I don't think we live in a transformatory moment. But on the other hand, perhaps this moment will open our eyes, say, like to the role of public health and the National Health Service in Britain. That's a wonderful development. Only thing is, Mr. Boris Johnson is going to put the money into it and going to win the election to boot. So, so I think, I hope people will think ahead, and the idea of a just and equal world, I think, is something that is brought home to us for in the times of the pandemic, and that's all of us react like that. But there are several of those who control our destinies in terms of economic and social power who do not think so. So I hope if it is not a moment of transformation, at least if it were a moment of awakening, I think that would be a jolly good thing to have.
Okay. So I kind of missed a bit while I was figuring out the laptop situation, but then I heard phrases of what happened, and I'm getting a lot of phrases. Thoughts. I just wanted to shift the conversation a bit about. So when you mention things like who benefits or are we winning, and the different responsibilities. So I wanted both of your opinions. You could go in any order about what you think would happen to the Paris Agreement and the CBDR and other such agreements and fundings that we have right now because of the lockdown.
Yeah, okay. I think what is practical terms, what is happening is that the climate negotiations have moved online. The dialogue at least is moving online. If you look at the first important statement from the Secretary General of the UNFCCC, Patricia Espinosa, she said very clearly that the pandemic and climate change are two different problems. So I am most grateful, because conflating the two is, I think, not helpful. So I think there is a lot of talk in Europe, obviously, about green recovery, because because the economy is in a state of deep crisis. It is very rarely that in economies across the world, both demand and supply have failed simultaneously. You have had demand problems, you had supply problems, or if both fail, you had it in only part of the world. Now across the world, we are having a failure of both demand and supply. Now, in such a situation, is green recovery the way to go? This will be debated. In India, I don't think it is the way to go. I think our economic situation is truly dire, though the government seems not to wake up to it. The government of India thinks that this is a transformatory moment in terms of large-scale structural economic reforms, which include also a generous dose of economic and political decentralization. All of these are not good portents for the future. So I think also that privileging, say, renewable energy over coal in the revival process would drive our electricity tariffs and our cost of energy through the roof. It's already quite one of the highest in the world. So it will drive it through the roof with large-scale effects on the economy, which are really, frankly, a bit unpredictable. So I think, you don't, suppose somebody, what should I say, falls down due to ill health caused by his diet. The first thing you do is to go and revive the patient. You don't send the dietitian as the first person to talk to the person who has fallen down because, of an illness caused by malnutrition or something. So I think we need to get the economy back on our feet in developing countries. India certainly. China and India are not comparable in that respect. So for us, I think this is the way we should look at the Paris Agreement. If you, in Europe, this will be debated. But on the other hand, if they have deeper pockets, there are better opportunities, there's more capacity. So if they could make it a green movement, that would be welcome. I'm not saying no. But on the other hand, the idea that this is universally a green movement for the entire world at one go, that I would be resistant to. So I think a lot depends when this pandemic eases off. Economic recovery will take quite a bit of while. And so we have to wait and watch how the climate scene evolves. But I don't think it's going to be dramatically pushed back. It's not going to be any substantially worse shape than it already is. But this emissions reduction of 1 year or 6 months, etc., don't bet on it. It's the cumulative emissions which matter. And this momentary decline in emissions is not particularly, I wouldn't write home about it. That's it.
Yeah, I agree. I do think, though, it's quite profound to see that what the impacts are in terms of pollution, and the major reductions in pollution during this time have been really profound in some places. From the transportation sector, from power plants and some other industrial plants, and you know, which has studies are showing the air quality is going up. So we do know that. But I agree, whether that's a transformative moment where we might realize, wow, it's wonderful not having so much pollution in our lives. If we could still have jobs and everything, that would be good too. I want to say, though, that there is I think there is an important connection to be made here between, you know, climate change or pollution issues and the pandemic. And that is that pollution affects the immune system, and, or at least our immune system capacities. So there's a very strong link between the kind of exposure we have, or the degree of risk that we have in terms of toxin exposure, and how well we can fend off something like this virus. And I think that's another reason why certain, you know, subordinated or marginalized groups also have a higher impact, because they also tend to be exposed to more toxins and pollution. So their immune systems may not be as strong as someone who has less exposure. So yeah, so I think, and you know, as I think I've already made the point repeatedly, I'm for interconnecting, because I think that things are very much connected. I agree with you that how connected they are, that is a good question to ask. But yeah, to de-link things, I see that as highly problematic. When you start separating things and isolating them, then yeah, the connections become invisible. And there are connections. It's all interconnected.
Just one point, Tamara, though, I would still like to see the evidence for pollution exposure being related to susceptibility to COVID-19, because I think they simply live more densely together. It may not be pollution. There are all kinds of lifestyle disease, non-communicable diseases that present vulnerability. So I think the pollution link, I would say, at least as far as I'm concerned, the jury is out on that until the evidence is in. It's certainly, it is a respiratory illness, so it is natural to seek a connection with respiratory stress as comes from pollution. But this is an odd business. The fact that it affects the lung, the manner of its affecting, and pollution, I think I would wait for the jury to come out. You know, I'm sure we'll see more of that as we go along.
So you don't see a connection between pollution and the immune system, and the immune system and the virus?
See, what I can
and
say
recovery. Let's think about recovery rates in terms of COVID-19.
No. For instance, is it proximity or pollution that determines the infectivity? So you can ask,
or exposure and risk.
Exposure and risk. That I think we have to check, and I don't think is very clear. So, for instance, are the infected fatality rates the same in rural areas or urban polluted areas? But it depends on, one has to control for the fact that population sizes are different, sample sizes are different. So once you control for all their factors, is clean air really a guarantee that you won't get it? Okay, the fact that
Yeah,
you
well,
live.
of course not. But, you know, there is higher incidence of, so we know that
Yeah, but that
COVID-19 is more dangerous for those with asthma and heart disease. And we do know, for example, that asthma is associated with risk exposure and also higher in poorer populations.
But I think that there again, I would say that certainly pollution is exacerbating asthma. Okay, and so the poverty asthma relation, is it to do with the inability to access asthma cure, or is it per se to do with pollution? And I think one has to figure that out properly. Like, for instance, the most, see, let me put it this way. 15, 20 years ago, the New York Times carried an extensive series, something like 8, 10 stories on the link between asthma in black populations in New York City and the conditions that they lived in. And it had nothing to do with air pollution. It was apartments which were stuffy, meaning there were sofas and furniture which was had mites in them, microorganisms, and this would set off allergic reactions. So the squalid, dense housing and the nature of the damp and air and the conditions they lived inside were responsible. It was not industrial pollution. And so unfortunately now in India, if you ask someone to do a study, the first thing they'll go for is air pollution. I agree, this is the biggest thing. But whether the same is true in other places, I don't know. So I think there are connections very clearly, but the manner and nature of connections, etc. So it's not as if, the point I'm trying to say is the larger point, that look, pollution, less pollution is good, it helps our immunity, we are better off at dealing with pandemics. I think it's too easy a message. But we need to figure more about that before.
Too easy or too difficult? Too
No,
difficult a
I think.
message.
No, I don't think so. I think we can message it, but I think we need to sort of ensure that we have the evidence in on that. That's all.
Yeah, I understand, yeah, that asthma is associated with indoor conditions and so on, but from a respiratory standpoint, yeah, definitely exposure to bad air has respiratory implications.
Okay, Tamara, if you want to make a quick remark, or maybe then we can proceed to the closing statements that you would like to give to all our listeners.
Okay, I want to thank you again for this really good discussion. I really appreciate this opportunity to meet T.J. and have this discussion about, we've gone down many pathways here, just starting with the environmental implications of COVID-19. But I think, and I guess my closing remarks would be that it reveals that this is, as T.J. also said, it is if it can't be a moment of transformation, it is certainly a moment of awareness and an opportunity for that. And so an opportunity to think about a lot of different aspects of our existence. And this has been a striking change in a lot of our lives all across the globe. So it is if it can't be a moment of transformation, as much as I hope it would be in the direction of more well-being across the world, then it is a moment of awareness to understand how yes, we are not all the same, and we are not all the same we, but we are very much interconnected, and this is, I hope part of that awareness would be to understand that interconnectedness, and to rethink perhaps how we understand the environment, not as, and understand it more maybe not as something that's separate, but very much something that we are a part of. And it's not out there, it's in here. Thank you. Thanks again.
Thanks for the remarks and for joining. TJ, how would you like to sum up today's discussion?
Let me join Tamara in thanking you for this opportunity, and also for the opportunity to meet and have this discussion. So I think, you know, it was difficult to sum up, you know, what has been a very interesting discussion, and we explored a lot of themes, or at least touched upon a lot of themes in what we said. So perhaps one of the thought that there are several thoughts that remain. So one perhaps prominent thought that remains with me is, you know, what we were talking about the economy, etc. So yes, Sasha made a reference to Marx somewhere in between, and I think one of Marx's great insights was to see the intrinsic aspect of labor to human society. So labor, you know, not in the sense of the production of value, but something a more ahistorical, you know, or rather that is persist through various historical periods. So I think labor, production, transforming the world is intrinsic to being human. We are the part of nature that is self-reflexive. I agree with Tamara in that sense, that it would be incorrect to talk of ourselves as outside of nature, but we are the part of nature that is self-reflexive. And perhaps it is in this sense that it is in our character to both transform the world and be responsible for it, its well-being. And its well-being, that relative separation is also our well-being, which is the moment of togetherness. Having said that, I must also emphasize that in my emphasis on not erasing the differences and inequalities of the world as we have it today and its impact in the era of the pandemic, but it is, I don't also want to give any impression that I disdain solidarity. There is, I think, there is a commonality across the world in the vast majority of humanity who would like far more control of their lives. And that is the common thread across the world. And it is whether it takes place in a far more economically deprived situation, as in my country, or it takes place in where material goods are much better endowed, as in Tamara's environment. But in all these places, we see greater control, greater say, and greater sense of direction over our lives. And this, I think, this common feeling inspires great solidarity. And I think there is also this very conversation that we had here today is, I think, expression of this solidarity that is so essential. And one day perhaps we will see that untainted or far less tainted by inequality, unlike today.
Thank you so much, both of you. I think what I take away is that we cannot believe in a transformative, believe in transformation, but we also have to realize that we are human and a part of nature. And yeah, I mean, there are, we have to believe in solidarity. Thank you so much for joining. And if there are any readings or links that you would like to share with our readers, please send them to us. We'll put them along with the podcast. Thank you.